Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving headfirst into the whirlwind of Indian politics.
Ooh, exciting.
You've given me a treasure trove of political science papers to dig into, and I am pumped.
I tried to pick some really fascinating ones.
From what I've seen, we're talking about everything from how political parties have changed over time to all the drama of regionalism and elections.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure.
It is, but this isn't just a history lesson. We're going to uncover the forces shaping India today, the stuff that's going to matter in the future.
Exactly. It's about understanding the dynamics at play.
You mentioned earlier that India is kind of a balancing act between unity and diversity. What did you mean by that?
Well, you see throughout these sources how India tries to balance accommodating all its different regional identities.
And there are a lot of them.
So many. While still striving for this sense of national integration.
It's like walking a tightrope, I imagine.
It really is a delicate dance, for sure.
Okay, so let's lay the groundwork here. Let's talk about political parties, the building blocks of any democracy.
The foundation.
Right. And the excerpts you gave categorize them in a familiar way. Reactionary, conservative, liberal, radical. It's like a global sampler platter.
It is a bit like that. And, just like with a sampler platter, some flavors are more popular depending on where you are.
True. So while those labels help us understand a party's stance on, say, sticking with tradition versus pushing for change, you can't forget the historical context, especially in India.
Exactly. Take the CPI and CPM, for example. They're both considered leftist parties pushing for big changes, but their actual influence varies wildly depending on which state you're in.
Each region is like its own political microclimate. And speaking of regions, we see that reflected in the rise of these regional parties. You mentioned them earlier.
Yeah, they're fascinating, aren't they?
They are, but what makes them tick? How do these regional powerhouses fit into the bigger picture of Indian politics?
Think of India like a giant, super intricate tapestry.
I like that image.
Each region brings its own unique threads, right? You've got different cultures, languages, even cuisines.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And the regional parties, they represent those threads. They become the voice for those unique identities.
Championing their causes.
Exactly. They fight for the specific needs and aspirations of their region.
Okay, that makes sense, but could you give me some concrete examples? It's hard to wrap my head around how much power a regional party could actually have on a national scale.
Oh, they have more than you might think. Take the Biju Janata Dal in Odisha, or the DMK and AIADMK down in Tamil Nadu, or even the Akali Dal in Punjab.
Okay, I recognize a few of those names.
They're deeply rooted in their respective regions and have huge support. And yeah, that influence, it spills over to the national level, especially with the rise of these coalition governments.
Coalition governments. Now that's where things get juicy, right? Tell me more about how those work.
Okay, so to form a government in India, you need a majority in parliament. Pretty straightforward.
Makes sense.
But often, no single national party gets that clear majority on their own.
Well,
So they have to buddy up. They need to form alliances with these regional parties to get those numbers.
I see. So suddenly those regional parties, they become kingmakers.
Exactly. They have a lot of bargaining power.
Right.
They can influence the national agenda, national policies. It's all about compromise, negotiation, a very delicate dance.
A high-stakes game of political chess. I can see how that can get really interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any examples from the past where these alliances really shook things up?
Oh, tons. There are definitely times when regional parties have held all the cards. They've been the deciding factor in whether a government survives or even dictated major policy changes.
Wow.
One example that comes to mind is the Janata Dal back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
They were instrumental in ushering in a period of coalition politics that really impacted things on a national scale.
So interesting. It seems like you'd need some serious political maneuvering skills to navigate all that.
Oh, for sure.
But let's step back for a second. We've talked about the players. But what about the stage where all this political drama unfolds? I was really struck by how these excerpts describe India's election commission. They don't mess around.
No, they don't. They have to be on top of their game.
Think about it. They're coordinating elections for a population larger than the entire continent of Europe. It boggles the mind.
It's a mammoth task. And they have to make sure it's all free and fair for this incredibly diverse population.
Exactly. How do they even begin to manage something that massive? What are their top priorities?
Well, their responsibilities are huge. I mean, they decide the boundaries of constituencies, they put together the electoral rolls, they're running the show on polling day.
It's a full-time job for sure.
Plus, they have to keep a close eye on campaign finances, making sure no one's buying their way into power or using intimidation tactics, which can be a problem with such a large electorate.
Makes sense. It's reassuring to know they're there, keeping things honest.
Yeah.
And what about the legal side of things? The sources mention this Representation of the People Act. What is that all about?
That act, the one from 1950, is basically the rule book for Indian elections.
The rule book
It
about.
lays out everything. Candidate nominations, who's even qualified to run, what counts as an election offense, how you handle disputes. It's the legal foundation for how those giant, complicated elections actually happen.
Wow, they thought of everything. And the fact that it's been around since 1950 says something about its staying power. But before that even, India's constitution laid the groundwork for elections, right?
Absolutely. The Constitution sets down some fundamental rules. For example, it guarantees adult franchise.
So everyone over 18 can vote.
Everyone. And in a country as diverse and with a history of inequality like India, that's a really big deal.
That's massive. It really shows their dedication to inclusivity, to making sure everyone's voice is heard. What else is in the Constitution about elections?
Well, there's this whole system for dealing with election disputes.
Okay, so if someone thinks something shady happened, there's a process for that.
Right. You can file an election petition with the high courts, and if you're still not happy, you can appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's a way to make sure the process is fair, that any irregularities are dealt with properly.
Checks and balances all the way up. I love it. Now, the sources also mention something called a model code of conduct. What is that, like a political etiquette guide?
It basically is. It's a set of guidelines for political parties and candidates to follow during the election period, a way to keep things civil, fair,
No low blows?
Exactly. It dictates what you can say in speeches, how you conduct rallies, whether you can use government resources. It's about leveling the playing field for everyone involved.
So no using your government jet to fly around campaigning. Got it.
Yeah.
It's like having a really good referee for a game, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
That's a great analogy.
But at the end of the day, the real MVPs of any election are the voters themselves. What influences how they vote in India? It's such a diverse country, it seems impossible to predict what drives people's choices.
You're right. It's a fascinating mix of factors. You see traditional influences playing a big role cast, religion, regional identity, things deeply ingrained in Indian society.
Those are some deep-seated influences for sure.
They really are. But on the other hand, you also have modern-day issues influencing voters. The economy, infrastructure development, even just a candidate's perceived ability to make positive changes.
So it's like trying to crack a code written in two different languages at the same time.
That's a great way to put it. Understanding Indian elections is like solving a giant jigsaw puzzle. You have all these pieces from different historical periods, different backgrounds, and they all fit together somehow.
Amazing. And speaking of things fitting together, let's go back to those coalition governments for a minute. What are some of the pros and cons of having these political alliances?
Well, on the plus side, coalitions can often lead to a more consensus-driven approach to politics. Parties have to find common ground, which can be a good thing, especially in a diverse nation like India.
Right, because you're forced to listen to different viewpoints, compromise a little.
Exactly. It promotes dialogue and collaboration. But of course, it's not always smooth sailing.
I imagine not.
One of the big downsides is that coalitions can be inherently unstable. There's always that risk of internal squabbling, political maneuvering, even the government collapsing before its turn is up.
Sounds like a bit of a tightrope walk as well.
Definitely. High risk, high reward.
Speaking of risk, what about politicians switching sides?
Defections.
Right. The sources mention something called the anti-defection law.
Yeah, that was enacted specifically to address that issue. Politicians playing musical chairs with their party affiliations, as they say. That's a part of their constitution, actually, the 10th schedule.
Wow, so it's serious business. What does it actually do, though? How do you stop a politician from just upping and switching teams whenever they feel like it?
So the law lays out very specific grounds for kicking a member out of parliament or the state legislatures if they defect from their party. It's designed to prevent what they call horse trading, where politicians switch allegiances just for personal gain or to gain a political advantage.
So it's a safeguard against opportunism, basically. And it sounds like India has a lot of experience dealing with that. But politics isn't just about parties and elections, is it? You have all these groups working behind the scenes, trying to influence policy. What can you tell me about pressure groups in India?
Pressure groups are like the invisible hand shaping the political landscape. They represent all sorts of interests, from big industries and businesses to social causes, religious communities.
Everyone wants a seat at the table.
That's it. And they use all sorts of tactics to try and sway government decisions in their favor.
It sounds like a high-stakes lobbying game.
It is.
Who are some of the big players in this game?
Oh, India has a whole spectrum of them. You've got powerful ones like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh.
Say that again?
The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. They're a right-wing Hindu nationalist group, very influential. They advocate for their ideology, obviously. Then you have trade unions fighting for workers' rights and groups representing different religious communities, each with its own agenda. It's quite a mix.
It's amazing how such a diverse range of groups can coexist and sometimes clash within the same political system. It really highlights the complexities of Indian democracy. And speaking of complexity, let's talk about this whole balancing act between diversity and the need for national unity. How does India approach that?
It's a challenge many nations face, but it's especially pronounced in India, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. With all that diversity, it must be a constant effort to maintain a sense of national unity.
Exactly. And the sources really highlight this focus on national integration and the obstacles that India faces in achieving it.
What are some of the biggest obstacles?
Well, you have so many languages, religions, cultural practices. There's always a chance for regionalism, communalism, linguistic tensions to flare up.
Those divisions run.
They do. And they can make it really difficult to foster that sense of shared identity, a shared purpose that national unity requires.
So how do you balance that? How do you acknowledge and celebrate the differences while also nurturing that feeling of unity?
Well, one of the ways India tries to do this is through institutions like the National Integration Council.
What do they do?
It brings together leaders from all walks of life, all backgrounds, to talk, to cooperate, to address those issues that could threaten national unity.
So it's about creating a space for open, honest dialogue about some very sensitive issues.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those differences, but also emphasizing those shared values, those shared goals.
Focusing on what unites rather than divides. That makes a lot of sense. Now, let's zoom out a little. Look at the bigger picture. How does India approach foreign policy?
One of the defining features of Indian foreign policy, especially during the Cold War, was this commitment to non-alignment. They didn't pick a side. They didn't side with the U.S. or the Soviet bloc. They wanted to chart their own course.
Strategic autonomy. Making decisions based on what was best for India, not what was best for some superpower.
Exactly. And while the whole context of the Cold War is gone, that principle, that strategic autonomy, it's still a major part of how India interacts with the world.
It makes sense.
But it's not about being isolationist or anything. India is a very active participant in international organizations like the United Nations. They want those strong ties with countries around the globe.
So it's about being a global citizen, but on your own terms.
Precisely. And part of that is this idea of Panchsheel.
Panchsheel. What's that?
It literally means 5 principles. 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that India has really championed in its international relations.
Okay, what are they?
Things like respecting each other's territory, not attacking each other, resolving disputes peacefully.
Sounds like a good plan.
Right. It's about promoting peace and cooperation on the world stage.
Those are good rules for everyone, not just countries. But in the real world, it's not always that simple, is it? You have to balance peace with security, especially for a country like India. What about their stance on nuclear weapons, particularly given the sometimes tense relationship with neighboring Pakistan?
It's definitely complicated. India's nuclear policy is built on this idea of no first use.
So they're saying they won't be the ones to start a nuclear war?
Exactly. They won't be the first to use nuclear weapons, but they reserve the right to retaliate if someone attacks them.
It's about deterrence, making sure they have a credible deterrent to discourage any potential adversary from even thinking about a nuclear strike.
That's it. It's a sobering topic, but it reflects the realities of the world we live in.
It does, unfortunately. Now, shifting gears a little bit, what about India's efforts to build stronger ties with Central Asian countries? What's the strategy behind that?
Central Asia is strategically really important. They act as this bridge between Asia and Europe, and India knows that. That's why they've been pushing for closer ties with their Connect Central Asia policy.
Connect Central Asia. So what's involved in that? Is it just about political and strategic alliances, or is there more to it?
It's a multi-pronged approach. Strengthening political ties, yes, but also boosting trade, encouraging more cultural exchange.
Okay, so it's about building those mutually beneficial relationships.
Exactly. Expanding India's influence in a region that's becoming more and more important globally.
It's amazing how geography, economics, and politics, they all intertwine on the world stage, don't they? Speaking of economics, let's talk about India's impressive economic growth lately.
Right. It's hard to ignore.
It seems like India's everywhere these days, from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. What do these sources have to say about it?
They paint a picture of remarkable progress, significant growth, a more diverse range of things being produced, especially in agriculture and technology.
So they're not just an outsourcing hub anymore.
Not at all. They're embracing new technologies, modern management practices. It's really driving this transformation.
It's a huge turnaround. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that people saw India as lagging behind in the global economy.
That's what makes it such a remarkable story. But it's not all sunshine and roses.
Right. There's always another side to the story.
Exactly. Despite the progress, they still have to deal with major challenges: poverty, inequality, regional disparities. Not everyone benefits equally from this growth.
It's that classic dilemma. How do you make sure the benefits of growth reach everyone, not just a select few?
Exactly. And the excerpts are very clear about this. They emphasize that progress needs to be inclusive. It needs to benefit all levels of society.
It's about making sure those benefits trickle down to the people who need them most. So how is India doing on that front? What about things like healthcare and education? Has there been progress?
There have been some big wins, particularly in healthcare. They've made huge strides in expanding access, especially in rural areas, way more primary healthcare centers, and their infant mortality rate has dropped significantly.
That's incredible. It's amazing how much of a difference those basic services can make in people's lives.
It really is. And in education, too. Access, particularly to primary education, has gotten much better. You're likely to find a primary school within walking distance in most villages now.
That's huge. It's about giving kids the tools they need to succeed, building a brighter future.
Exactly. But while more kids are going to school, there are still concerns about the quality of education, especially in rural areas and for disadvantaged communities.
It's a reminder that there's still work to be done.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about deep-rooted social issues like the caste system. True progress means tackling these inequalities head-on.
It's about more than just economic indicators. You need social progress as well. And that brings us to another important topic. I was particularly struck by what these excerpts had to say about gender justice and equality in India. It seems like women there still face so many obstacles.
It's true. Despite having equality enshrined in their constitution, the reality for a lot of women is far from equal. They still face discrimination, violence, and you just have to look at the skewed sex ratio. Fewer women than men, to see how deep-rooted those patriarchal attitudes are.
It's disheartening. It shows how much work still needs to be done to empower women, to dismantle those harmful social norms.
Absolutely, and empowerment is key. It's not just about enacting laws. You have to change how people think, create a society where women have genuine equality of opportunity, where they're free from fear, free from discrimination.
It's a huge undertaking. Wow, we have covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the mechanics of their political system, their economic and social landscape, even their place on the world stage.
That's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it's clear that India is a country full of incredible diversity and some stark contrasts.
That's India in a nutshell.
It's a nation that's constantly changing, grappling with its past, but also striving to build a better future.
And that makes it so fascinating to study.
It really does. But there's so much more to uncover. We haven't even touched on India's independent institutions.
Oh, we have to delve into those. They're fascinating.
We'll save that for our next deep dive. Stay tuned as we keep exploring the intricacies of Indian politics.
You know, it's funny, we talk about India's democracy.
Right.
It's like this big, complex machine
Right.
with all these moving parts.
All those cogs and gear.
Exactly. And the independent institutions, they're like these crucial cogs, making sure everything runs smoothly.
Keeping the whole thing from falling apart.
That's it. They keep the government in check, ensure things are fair, transparent, accountable,
It's like they built these safeguards right into the system.
precisely.
So give me some examples. What are some of these all-important institutions?
Okay, well, a good place to start is the Union Public Service Commission.
The UPSC.
Yeah, you probably heard of them. They're the ones responsible for recruiting people for the Indian civil services.
Oh, wow. Big job.
Huge. Think about it. They're finding people to fill some of the most important jobs in the country.
And for a population that size.
I know, right? And so diverse. So they have to make sure they're getting the best of the best.
They're like the gatekeepers, making sure only the most qualified candidates get through.
That's a great way to put it. Rigorous exams, interviews, background checks, the whole 9 yards.
And all while trying to keep it all free from political influence.
That's the key, right? Making sure it's about merit, not who you know.
Exactly. So recruitment, that's one part of it. But do they do anything else once those civil servants are hired?
Oh yeah, their job doesn't end there. They advise the government on all sorts of personnel issues, promotions, transfers, even disciplinary actions.
Wow, so they're really involved in the whole career trajectory.
They are. They're like the guardians of good governance within the civil services.
Making sure everything's by the book.
Exactly.
Okay, that's the personnel side of things. But what about the money? Who's keeping an eye on the government spending to make sure it's all above board?
Well, that's where the Comptroller and Auditor General of India comes in.
The CAG.
Yep, they're the financial watchdog. They audit the accounts of both the central government and the state governments.
No one gets a free pass.
Exactly. They want to make sure every rupee is accounted for.
Making sure they're not using taxpayer money to throw lavish parties.
Exactly. It's about ensuring those funds are used for their intended purpose, not lost to corruption or inefficiency.
It's got to be a tough job keeping track of all that.
It's a big responsibility, for sure, but it's crucial for a functioning democracy.
It really is. So they do the audits, but what happens then? How do they actually hold the government accountable?
Well, their reports, they're presented to Parliament, to the state legislatures.
Okay, so they make their findings public.
They do. And that public accountability is a powerful tool.
It's like having this financial detective on the case, shining a light on any discrepancies or shady dealings.
I like that.
Gives you a bit more faith in the system.
Yeah.
So we've talked about good governance, financial accountability, but India also has a lot of social challenges.
Definitely. Deeply rooted ones, too.
Are there any institutions specifically focused on addressing things like social inequality?
There are.
Okay.
And they play a vital role, especially in a country where these social hierarchies are so ingrained.
Right, because it's not enough to just have laws on the books. You need a way to enforce them, to protect the rights of those who've been marginalized.
Exactly. And that's where these institutions come in. Take the National Commissions for Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes, for example.
I've heard those terms before, but remind me what they refer to.
Sure. So the scheduled castes, sometimes you'll hear them called Dalits. They've historically faced really intense discrimination, social exclusion because of the caste system. And then the scheduled tribes, or Adivasis, they're indigenous communities who've also been marginalized. These commissions were specifically created to protect their interests.
To make sure they have a voice, that they have equal rights.
Exactly. It's about trying to create a more just and equitable society.
What a vitally important job they have. So what do they actually do? How do they go about achieving that?
Well, they wear a lot of hats. They investigate any complaints of discrimination. They make sure those welfare programs that are supposed to help these communities are actually working. They advise the government on policies that directly affect them.
Wow, so they're like watchdogs, advocates, and advisors all rolled into one.
Exactly. It's a big job.
It really is. Now, thinking about diversity a bit more, what about linguistic minorities? I mean, India has so many languages. Are there any safeguards for those who don't speak the dominant language?
You're right to bring that up. India's constitution actually recognizes the importance of linguistic diversity.
That's pretty cool.
It really is. They even have a commissioner for linguistic minorities who plays a similar role to those commissions we talked about earlier.
It sounds like they've really tried to think about the needs of all the different groups within India, making sure everyone feels included.
That's the goal anyway, to build a truly inclusive democracy.
It's a great goal to have, for sure. But I imagine it's one thing to create these institutions and another to make sure they're actually effective.
You're right about that. It's an ongoing process, and the sources do highlight some concerns about how well these institutions are actually working.
Like what kinds of concerns?
Well, things like bureaucracy slowing things down, political interference, even just not having enough funding.
So those classic challenges, bureaucracy, funding, politics, they can derail even the best intentions.
We really can. It's a reminder that building a truly just and equitable society is an ongoing battle.
It definitely is. Were there any other areas where the sources saw room for improvement?
One that came up a lot was the need for electoral reform.
Oh, interesting. So even though they have this robust electoral system overall, there are still things they're grappling with.
Exactly. Voter apathy, the influence of money, even the criminalization of politics. These are things that plague democracies all over the world, not just India.
That's for sure. So what's the solution? What are people proposing?
There's a lot of talk about strengthening that model code of conduct we talked about earlier, making campaign financing more transparent, even exploring new voting systems that might lead to better representation.
It's good that they're having those conversations, constantly trying to improve the system.
It's the only way to make progress.
Definitely. Now, speaking of making progress, there was something else in the sources that really caught my eye. This whole idea of constitutional reform.
Ah, yes. Big topic.
Amending the Constitution is not something you take lightly. What sparked these discussions?
Well, back in 2000, they set up this national commission to review the working of the Constitution, basically to see if it was still doing what it was supposed to be doing.
A constitutional checkup. I love it.
Right. And their report, it came out a few years later, and it really got people talking. It highlighted some areas where the Constitution might need some updating.
So what were some of the big recommendations? What did they think needed to change?
Oh, there were a lot. From tweaking the election laws to reforming how Parliament and the state legislatures function. But one of the most interesting suggestions was this idea of a constructive vote of no confidence.
Constructive vote of no confidence? What does that even mean?
So there's like a regular vote of no confidence where Parliament can say, we don't have confidence in the government anymore.
Right, which can lead to the government collapsing.
Exactly. But with a constructive vote, they have to do more than just say they have no confidence. They have to actually propose an alternative leader at the same time.
Ah, I see. So it's like saying, okay, you want to tear this government down, but you better have a plan for what you're going to build in its place.
Exactly. It's about encouraging more responsibility, more accountability from the opposition. You can't just create chaos without offering a viable alternative.
That makes a lot of sense. What else? What other big ideas came out of this review?
One that stands out was limiting the size of the Council of Ministers.
Ah, trying to streamline things, make the government more efficient.
Precisely. Smaller cabinet, less government spending, especially important in a country like India with limited resources, so many developmental needs. They also talked about giving more power to local communities through the Panchayati Raj institutions.
It's about finding that balance, right? Between a strong central government and empowering people at the grassroots level.
That's it, the constant balancing act.
Were there any recommendations about the judicial system?
Actually, yes. They pointed out the delays, the backlogs, the fact that it can be really difficult for some people, particularly the marginalized communities, to get justice.
Those are serious issues. Justice delayed is justice denied, as they say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they proposed a bunch of reforms aimed at making the justice system faster, fairer, more accessible to everyone.
Which is how it should be. A well-functioning judicial system is so fundamental to a healthy democracy.
Couldn't agree more. But you know, it's not just about these older institutions we've been talking about. There are newer organizations that are playing an increasingly important role in India today.
Oh, like who? Give me some examples.
Well, one that's particularly interesting is NET Ayog.
NET Ayog. Okay, I'm not familiar with them.
They're relatively new, actually.
Oh.
Established in 2015 to replace the old Planning Commission.
So a new kid on the block with a big job to do. What prompted that change?
There was a feeling that the Planning Commission, which was very much about the central government dictating everything.
Top-down approach.
Exactly. That it just wasn't working for a rapidly changing India anymore. They needed something more flexible, more collaborative.
Enter NITI Aayog.
Enter NITI Aayog. They're more like a think tank. They offer policy advice. They encourage more cooperation between the central government and the states.
Okay, so more of a partnership approach.
Exactly.
I like that.
And they're not just focused on India internally. They're also looking outwards, trying to learn from best practices around the world.
It's about being open to new ideas, right? Finding solutions that have worked elsewhere.
Precisely.
So what are they focused on? What are their top priorities?
Well, they have a lot on their plate, but some of the big ones are sustainable development, boosting agriculture, improving healthcare and education, and promoting innovation, encouraging people to start businesses.
So it's about building a better future for India, but doing it in a way that's sustainable.
Exactly. They're trying to create a modern, prosperous India, but one that's also equitable, where everyone has a chance to succeed.
That's a great vision. But it's not all about economics and development, is it? You also need to think about security.
Right. You can't have progress without security.
And the sources you gave me, they talked about organizations like the Central Bureau of Investigation, the CBI, and the Lokpal and Lokayuktas. What are their roles?
Okay, so the CBI, they're like India's FBI.
The top dogs.
Exactly. They handle the big cases, the complex ones, corruption, financial crimes, terrorism.
So they're brought in when you need those specialized skills, that expertise.
Exactly. The Lokpal and Lokayukas, they're a little different. They're what's called ombudsman institutions.
Ombudsman, I'm not familiar with that term.
Basically, they act as independent bodies that investigate complaints against public officials. So if you think a politician or a civil servant is up to no good, you can go to them.
They're like a check on the abuse of power, making sure those in charge are held accountable.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
They're essential for maintaining public trust in government.
Definitely. But with all this talk about accountability, security, we can't forget about individual rights and freedoms. How does India balance those competing priorities, especially in today's world with all the concerns about terrorism?
It's a question that all democracies are grappling with. In India, you have the National Human Rights Commission. They act as a kind of watchdog, making sure the government doesn't go too far in the name of security.
So they're there to protect individual liberties.
Exactly. They investigate any complaints of human rights violations,
Yeah.
conduct inquiries, make recommendations to the government.
It's about making sure that the pursuit of security doesn't come at the expense of fundamental freedoms.
Precisely. It's about finding that balance, that middle ground, where security and liberty can coexist, which is not always easy.
No, it's a constant tightrope walk. Now, one more thing, and I know this is a big one. What about freedom of information? Do Indian citizens have the right to access information held by the government?
They do. And it's thanks to a very important piece of legislation, the Right to Information Act, or RTI.
I've heard of that. It's been huge, right?
Absolutely transformative. The RTI basically empowers any citizen to request information from public authorities.
Wow, so it really opens things up.
It does. It forces the government to be more transparent, more accountable. And it's been incredibly effective in exposing corruption, uncovering wrongdoing.
It's like shining a light on all those dark corners where shady stuff can happen.
That's a great way to put it. It's been a game changer for transparency and good governance in India. But of course, no system is perfect.
There are always going to be challenges.
Always. With something like this, there are always going to be those who try to weaken it, who push back against transparency.
You have to be constantly vigilant.
You do. But despite the challenges, the RTI remains a powerful symbol. It shows what's possible when citizens are empowered, when they have the right to hold their government accountable.
It's a great example for other democracies to follow. But speaking of holding people accountable, we can't forget about the very real threat of terrorism.
Right, that's an ongoing battle.
What are the agencies responsible for keeping India safe?
Well, one of the most important is the National Investigation Agency, or NIA. They're on the front lines of the fight against terrorism.
What kind of terrorism are we talking about here? What sorts of threats do they deal with?
Oh, it's a whole range of things. You've got separatist movements, religious extremism, even international terrorist groups with links to India.
It's a big job with high stakes.
It really is. And one of their biggest challenges is simply coordinating all the different agencies involved.
You've got different state police forces, intelligence agencies, the central government. It's a lot to keep track of.
It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle trying to put all the pieces together. And they have to do it while also navigating some very tricky legal and ethical considerations.
Trying to balance national security with individual rights.
Exactly. It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it.
They are literally keeping people safe. Wow, this is incredible. We've just scratched the surface, haven't we?
We have. But I think it's a good overview of just how complex and fascinating India's political landscape really is.
It really is. From the history of its political parties to these institutions we've been talking about, it's clear that India is a country that's constantly changing, constantly adapting.
And that makes it so interesting to study. You never know what's going to happen next.
Exactly. But we're not done yet. There's one more aspect of Indian democracy that we need to talk about.
Oh, you mean grassroots democracy?
Exactly. The Panchayati Raj system.
Ah, yes. That's where things get really interesting. We're going to see how democracy plays out at the village level.
All right, let's get down to the ground level, shall we?
Down to earth.
Exactly. We're talking about India's Panchayati Raj system.
Ah, grassroots democracy.
Right. From what I understand, it's about taking those democratic principles and really embedding them in every village.
That's a great way to put it. Empowering people at the local level, giving them a direct say in the decisions that affect their lives. Everything from building roads and schools to resolving those everyday disputes.
It's like a direct line of communication between the people and their government, cutting out all that bureaucracy in between.
Exactly. It's about making government work for the people at a level they can really engage with.
So how does it actually work in practice? Paint me a picture of this village-level democracy.
Okay, well, picture a three-tiered structure.
3 tiers, okay.
At the bottom, you have the Gram Sabha. That's like the village assembly. every adult resident can participate.
It's democracy in action, like a town hall meeting.
Exactly. They can speak their minds, raise concerns, hold their elected officials accountable.
I love that. So that's the village level. What about the higher tiers?
Right. So above that, you have the Panchayat Samiti at the block level, and then the Zilla Parishad at the district level.
So it's a way of organizing things so that there's representation at different levels of local governance.
Exactly. It's about making sure everyone has a voice.
What kind of power do these local bodies actually have? What do they handle on a day-to-day basis?
They actually have a lot of responsibility. Things like sanitation, drinking water, local schools, healthcare facilities. They implement government schemes, too, and even mobilize resources for local development projects.
Wow, so they're really on the front lines of improving people's lives.
We are. And because they're so connected to their communities, they often have a much better understanding of what those communities actually need, more so than some official sitting in an office miles away.
It's about bringing governance closer to the people, making it more relevant to their daily lives. But like any system, I'm sure there are challenges. What are some of the hurdles these Panchayati Raj institutions face?
Oh, for sure. The excerpts highlight a few. One is political interference, unfortunately.
So even at the village level, you can't escape politics completely.
Sadly not. Local power struggles, political loyalties, they can get in the way of the democratic process.
Yeah.
And then there's corruption, of course.
It seems like corruption is a problem everywhere.
It's a challenge, for sure. Another issue is making sure these local bodies actually have what they need to do their jobs properly. Training for those elected representatives, adequate funding, transparency, those are all essential.
It's one thing to have the system in place, it's another to make sure it's functioning effectively.
Absolutely. But even with those challenges, the whole idea of empowering communities at the grassroots level, it's such a powerful concept.
It is. And it seems to be gaining momentum around the world.
It does. People are realizing that when you give communities more control over their own destinies, good things can happen.
It's about trusting people to know what's best for themselves and their communities. As we wrap up this deep dive into Indian politics, I'm struck by the incredible diversity of this country, the enormous challenges it faces, but also the incredible resilience and hope that shines through.
You've summed it up beautifully. It's a country that constantly defies expectations, constantly evolving, always searching for a better future.
And it reminds us that democracy is a journey, not a destination. It requires participation, vigilance, a willingness to learn and adapt.
Well said.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the intricacies of Indian politics with you today.
The pleasure was all mine. Always happy to talk about India.
I can tell. Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.